As a doctor, I have seen many things in my career. I have seen people at their best and their worst. I have seen life and death, joy and sorrow. But nothing could have prepared me for what I experienced at the Ravenwood Mental Asylum. I was assigned to Ravenwood as part of my residency program. It was a notorious institution, known for its brutal treatment of patients and its high suicide rate. But I was eager to learn, and I was determined to make a difference. When I arrived at Ravenwood, I was immediately struck by its gloomy atmosphere. The buildings were old and decrepit, and the grounds were overgrown with weeds. The air was thick with the smell of death and decay. I was assigned to work on Ward B, the most disturbed ward in the asylum. The patients on Ward B were the most violent and unpredictable. They were also the most dangerous. One of my first patients was a man named John. John was a large, muscular man with a wild look in his eyes. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he was prone to violent outbursts. One day, John was sitting in the common room when he suddenly jumped up and started screaming. He grabbed a chair and threw it at the wall. I rushed over to him and tried to calm him down, but he was too strong. He pushed me away and ran out of the room. I followed John down the hallway, but he was too fast for me. He turned a corner and disappeared. I searched for him for hours, but I couldn't find him. Finally, I gave up and went back to the common room. The other patients were shaken up, but they were unharmed. I told them that John had escaped and that we needed to lock down the ward. We waited for hours, but John never returned. The next day, we found his body hanging from a tree in the forest behind the asylum. He had committed suicide. John's death was just the beginning. In the following weeks, several other patients on Ward B committed suicide. I was starting to feel overwhelmed. I didn't know what to do. One night, I was working the late shift on Ward B. I was alone, and the patients were all asleep. I was sitting at my desk, charting, when I heard a noise. I looked up and saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a young woman, dressed in a white nightgown. She had long, dark hair and pale skin. The woman looked at me with her sad, empty eyes. "Help me," she whispered. I stood up and walked over to the doorway. "What's wrong?" I asked. The woman didn't answer. She just stared at me with her empty eyes. I reached out to touch her, but she pulled away. "Don't touch me," she said. "I'm not real." I stepped back, confused. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I'm a ghost," the woman said. "I died here, in this asylum." I didn't believe her at first. But then she told me things that only someone who had been at the asylum would know. She told me the names of the patients who had committed suicide, and she told me the details of their deaths. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run away, but I couldn't leave the patients alone. "Why are you here?" I asked the ghost. "I'm here to warn you," she said. "This place is evil. It's cursed. You need to get out of here before it's too late." The ghost disappeared, and I was left alone in the doorway. I didn't know what to believe, but I knew that I had to get out of Ravenwood. I finished my shift and went back to my apartment. I packed my bags and didn't look back. I left Ravenwood that night, and I never went back. I don't know if the ghost was real or not, but I know that Ravenwood is a cursed place. It's a place where nightmares come true. I'm still a doctor, but I no longer work in psychiatry. I'm afraid of what I might see. I'm afraid of what I might become. But I'll never forget the things I saw at Ravenwood. I'll never forget the ghosts that haunt its halls. I've been back to Ravenwood since I left. It was abandoned a few years ago, and it's now in ruins. But I can still feel the evil. I've been a doctor for over 20 years now, and I've seen a lot of things. But nothing could have prepared me for what I experienced at that mental asylum. It was a cold, rainy night when I first arrived. The asylum was located on a hilltop, overlooking the town. It was a large, imposing building with dark, boarded-up windows. I felt a chill run down my spine as I approached it. I was met at the door by a man named Dr. Williams. He was a tall, thin man with pale skin and sunken eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Welcome to the asylum," he said. "I'm Dr. Williams. I'll be your guide." He led me through the dark, winding corridors of the asylum. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and decay. I could hear the sound of moaning and screaming coming from behind the closed doors. "These are the patients," Dr. Williams said. "They're all very sick." We stopped at a door at the end of the hall. Dr. Williams opened the door and we stepped inside. The room was dark and cramped. There was a single bed in the corner, and a man was sitting on the edge of the bed. He was thin and gaunt, with long, greasy hair. His eyes were wide and staring. "This is Mr. Smith," Dr. Williams said. "He's one of our most difficult patients." Mr. Smith looked up at me and smiled. It was a cold, empty smile. "Hello?" he said. "I've been waiting for you." I felt a shiver run down my spine. I didn't know why, but I felt like Mr. Smith knew me. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I know what you're here for," he said. "You're here to help me." I took a step back. "How do you know that?" "I just know," he said. "I've been waiting for you for a long time." I turned to Dr. Williams. "What's going on?" Dr. Williams shrugged. "I don't know," he said. "Mr. Smith is a very strange man." "I'm not strange," Mr. Smith said. "I'm just different." He stood up and walked over to me. He put his hand on my shoulder and looked into my eyes. "I need your help," he said. "I'm the only one who can save you." I didn't know what to say. I was starting to feel scared. "I have to go," I said. "I'll come back tomorrow." I turned and ran out of the room. Dr. Williams followed me. "What's wrong?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. "I just felt weird." "Don't worry about it," Dr. Williams said. "Mr. Smith is just a little eccentric." I didn't know what to believe. I still felt like Mr. Smith knew me. But I also knew that he was a patient in a mental asylum. I went back to the asylum the next day, but I didn't see Mr. Smith. Dr. Williams told me that he was in solitary confinement. "He was getting a little too agitated," Dr. Williams said. "We thought it was best to give him some time to cool down." I was relieved. I didn't want to see Mr. Smith again. I spent the next few days at the asylum, meeting with patients and learning about their conditions. It was a difficult job, but it was also rewarding. One day, I was walking down the hall when I saw Mr. Smith. He was standing at the end of the hall staring at me. I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned and walked the other way. I tried to avoid Mr. Smith, but he was always there. He would follow me down the halls and watch me from the shadows. I was starting to feel afraid. I didn't know what Mr. Smith wanted with me. One night, I was working late in my office when I heard a noise outside. I went to the door and looked out into the hallway. Mr. Smith was standing there smiling. "I told you I'd be back," he said. I slammed the door shut. I arrived at the asylum on a cold, rainy night. The building was dark and imposing, its silhouette looming against the stormy sky. I had been assigned to work here as a nurse, and I was both excited and apprehensive. I had heard stories about this place, but I had never imagined it would be so unsettling. I made my way through the front doors and into the lobby. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and decay. I could hear the sound of moaning and screaming coming from somewhere down the hall. A nurse approached me and introduced herself as Sarah. She gave me a quick tour of the facility, explaining the different wards and the patients who resided there. "The most disturbed patients are on Ward C," she said. "That's where you'll be working." I swallowed hard. Okay. Sarah led me down a long, dark hallway. The only sound was the echo of our footsteps. We finally came to a heavy metal door. "This is it," Sarah said. She unlocked the door and we stepped inside. Ward C was a large room with rows of beds. The patients were all restrained, either by their hands or their feet. Some of them were mumbling to themselves, while others were staring blankly at the ceiling. One patient in particular caught my eye. He was a large man with a shaved head and a wild look in his eyes. He was strapped to a bed, his arms and legs flailing. "Who's that?" I asked.
"His name is Michael,"
Sarah said. "He's the most dangerous patient in the asylum." I shivered. "What did he do?" "He killed his wife and children," Sarah said. "He was declared insane and sent here." I looked at Michael again. He was still thrashing about, his eyes filled with hatred. I felt a chill run down my spine. "I don't think I can work here," I said. "It's okay to be scared," Sarah said, "but you'll get used to it." I took a deep breath. "I guess I'll have to." Sarah left me alone with the patients. I stood there for a moment, feeling overwhelmed. I didn't know if I could do this, but then I thought about the money I needed to pay off my student loans. I had to make this work. I walked over to one of the beds and introduced myself to the patient. His name was John, and he was suffering from schizophrenia. He was a sweet and gentle man, and I quickly warmed to him. I spent the rest of the day caring for the patients on Ward C. I fed them, bathed them, and gave them their medication. I also tried to talk to them and get to know them. At the end of the day, I was exhausted but exhilarated. I had survived my first day at the asylum. I quickly fell into a routine at the asylum. I would arrive for work early in the morning and leave late at night. I didn't have much of a social life, but I didn't mind. I was too busy with my work. I enjoyed caring for the patients. They were all different, but they all had one thing in common. They were all suffering. I wanted to help them in any way I could, but there were also some challenges. Some of the patients were violent and unpredictable. I had to be careful at all times. One day, I was working on Ward C when Michael escaped from his restraints. He lunged at me, his eyes filled with rage. I screamed and tried to run, but he was too fast. He grabbed me by the throat and lifted me off the ground. I thought I was going to die. But then Sarah came running in. She hit Michael over the head with a fire extinguisher, knocking him unconscious.
"Are you okay?"
Sarah asked. I nodded, still shaking from the experience. "You should be more careful," Sarah said. "Michael is a dangerous man." I knew she was right, but I couldn't help but feel sorry for him. He was clearly suffering from a mental illness. He didn't deserve to be locked up in this place. I had been working at the asylum for a few months.